to order. Et puis pour today again with us. Mr. Benson has been made a full member of the committee. Welcome, Mr. Benson. This is a great honor. Great honor. Welcome. Congratulations, and it's good to know that you'll be with us. It's good to have the certainty that you'll be with us regularly. Should mention that the clerk has circulated an invitation from the Royal Norwegian Embassy pertaining to COP15. And please send any questions you have about that invitation to the clerk, or reach out to the embassy using the indicated coordinates. En raison du volume assez élevé.
Because of the high volume of requests that are bogging down our translation team, we will not, on a temporary basis, be sending out speaking notes in hard copies to the members because they can't provide the translation services quickly enough. So I would confirm that any briefs received before Friday, December the 2nd, of this Friday, will be translated and will be received by the committee. And we'll be studying clause by clause when? On the 8th? No, the 9th. Okay. So there won't be any distribution of briefs or speaking notes before the appearance of witnesses. I want to emphasize that witnesses have completed their technical tests. They were completed concerning the sound quality, and everything is in order. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our witnesses. For panel 1, we have Caitlin Mitchell, staff lawyer with the Animal Justice Canada Legislative Fund. We also have from the Canadian Paint and Coatings Association, Mr. Gary Leroux, who's President and Chief Executive Officer, and I hope I'm going to pronounce it correctly, the Snuneymuxw First Nation, Joan Brown, Chief Administrative Office.
Without any further ado, we'll start with Ms. Mitchell for 3 minutes for opening remarks, please. Ms. Mitchell.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss this incredibly important bill. By amending Canada's toxics law, Canada has an exciting opportunity to phase out the unnecessary use of animals in painful toxicity testing and to position Canada as a global leader when it comes to developing non-animal testing methods. Testing to determine whether a chemical poses health or environmental risks is one of the most harmful types of animal use in Canadian science. Many experiments fall under the highest category of invasiveness, according to the Canadian Council on Animal Care, causing severe pain at, near, or above the pain tolerance threshold of unanesthetized conscious animals. In 2019 alone, more than 90,000 animals were used in toxicity tests, falling into this most severe category of harm. The good news is that in Canada and around the world, scientists are rapidly developing non-animal test methods, and many are better than animal studies at predicting human responses to environmental exposures. They're also more rapid and cost-effective. Ending the unnecessary use of animals in scientific research is also an objective for which there is strong public support across political lines. For all of these reasons, when the EU and US modernized their toxics laws, they included strong requirements to avoid and ultimately phase out toxicity testing on animals. Here in Canada, the Liberal Party made a commitment during the last federal election to eliminate toxicity testing on animals by 2035. And through Bill S5, this committee can ensure Canada meets this deadline. Many of the amendments passed by the Senate will help put Canada on track, but further amendments are needed. I've set out details in my brief, but at a high level, Animal Justice would like to see strengthened language to ensure testing on animals is done only as a last resort, the ability to make regulations to protect certain invertebrates, such as octopuses, in the future as the need arises, and third, greater focus on replacing and reducing the use of animals in toxicity testing and not merely refining the ways in which they're being used. And briefly, with respect to Part 6 of the Act, it's widely expected that an increasing number of genetically modified animals will be developed for varying uses in the coming years. Part 6 treats genetically modified animals in the same way as it treats chemical substances and ignores entirely the welfare of the animals themselves. Yet we know that deliberate attempts to influence the genetic makeup of animals can have significant animal welfare implications, including harmful procedures or unanticipated effects, such as developmental abnormalities, skeletal abnormalities, or enhanced growth of tumors. I appreciate that the government has committed to conducting a comprehensive review of Part 6 at a future date, but in the meantime, we propose at the very least enabling the creation of regulations to protect the welfare of genetically modified animals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. We'll go now to Mr. Leroux for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We believe the elected MPs on the ENVI House of Commons Committee are best placed to address real concerns in Bill S5. We also believe government officials are best placed to determine the validity of the proposed amendments ultimately. What we absolutely do not support are amendments made in haste and without substantive data supporting those amendments, which go beyond the scope of the bill, the government's original bill. Our industry supports government's originally proposed amendments in Bill S5. However, more clarity is needed on certain definitions and implementation. Some are just impractical and not aligned with Canada's chemical assessment process as we see it. For example, an unworkable chemical watch list, defaming regulated chemicals in commerce, and lessening consumer confidence in all regulated products by the government. Limiting time for robust chemical assessments that could lead to better outcomes, in fact. Identifying chemical substitutes without understanding the many technical challenges required in formulation and reformulations. Duplicative labeling of consumer products already addressed in multiple and better placed acts, in fact, and removing CBI protection for innovative chemistry, which preclude more sustainable alternatives or substitutes in future. Based on years of staff working full-time with the technical committees, bilateral and multilateral meetings with government on chemicals management, we understand what works. That includes how better data leads to better outcomes and how industry and government must work together. It is much easier to oppose and condemn a mature and proven regulatory approach without substantive data, yet that is what you are being asked to do in many cases. CEPA's chemicals management plan is one that is arguably better than others in the world and in fact copied in large measure by the United States, Australia, Mexico, and Brazil. And Brazil just announced it last week that they're following the CMP process largely. Canada's chemical assessment process is not easy. It has a very high standard for critical data required for chemicals management. It is complex, costly, and very onerous. At times it is frustrating when you lose a chemical used in hundreds of products in commerce in Canada. The process has taxed our sector greatly, with more than 1,500 substances assessed in the first 3 phases of the CMP of 4,200 substances, 525 of 1,500 in the most recent phase of CMP3. But we believe it is necessary. Our members support it because it is a risk-based approach to chemicals management that ensures consumer products are safe. Our members in Canada and those exporting to Canada are mandated to provide substantive data collected over many years in sophisticated R&D facilities, countless studies, trial formulations, reformulations, etc., etc. It is impossible to suggest a hard stop for such a complex process that always seeks new data and better sources. It sometimes comes together at the 11th hour or past the designated timeline, but industry and government gets to the assessment, gets it done.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there,
that.
Mr. Leroux. We're over 3 minutes. We'll go now to Ms. Brown. Who's on?
Hello, my name is Joan Brown from Snuneymuxw First Nation. I'm very humbled and honored to join this sacred circle to talk about such an important topic. Institutions claim that Indigenous people are a vulnerable people, but we are not inherently vulnerable. We are only vulnerable people because of the multiple man-made industrial stresses that our vulnerable land has been subjected to. And what we know is that the stresses on the environment do not stop at our communities. These stresses know no boundaries. We are seeing increases rates of cancer and chronic disease in our families. When we look around our neighborhoods, we see the many economic drivers of the environmental stresses, including historic coal mines, industrial port, logging, pulp mills, tanker traffic, farming operations, air traffic, and waste management. Our question remains, what happens when all these toxins submerge onto each other? What is the cumulative impact? These man-made stresses have interrupted our way of being. Food security, clean water, access to medicines, and seafood. These are all critical to our wellness and ceremonial way of life. We are experiencing the impacts, including increased morbidity and cancer rates. We know that within a single neighborhood, 25% of our residents have either died of or are living with cancer. We know the world is made up of vital connections, a profound interconnectedness. The existing mainstream siloed approach used to address vulnerable lands does not work. We need to investigate the cumulative impacts with a balanced approach where an Indigenous and scientific approach walk hand in hand. We know that this work is generational, but we cannot knowingly sacrifice a generation while we begin this investigation. There is important work and there is urgent work. So Nemo Chief and Council and our elders have deemed this work to be urgent. Because we have forgotten how to hear the voice of the land is showing her sickness in the form of cancer and disease throughout our community. We understand that she is on her last breath. Since the beginning of time, the old people learned from the land and understood how to work together with the land and each other in the face of the harsh natural terrain. Today, the landscape is harsh, but it is man-made. Poverty, addiction, family violence, and the climate crisis. Now more than ever, we need to remove the false boundaries and work together or we won't survive.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. We'll go now to the first round. Mr. Deltel for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for participating in this parliamentary committee on S5.
Of the Canadian Paint and Coatings Association. Mr. Leroux, in your testimony, you talk about that this bill is going beyond the amendment made by the senators are beyond what the bill is. So you said that you did support the essence of the bill S5, but now you have big concern. Can you raise specifically which amendment make you feel uncomfortable with this bill now?
Well, there are amendments that go to the heart of what we're doing with respect to labeling. Labeling, there are a number of acts, for instance, that they're seeking to have more labeling for. When you look at what we're faced with now in terms of labeling, we have the Hazardous Products Act, we have the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations, which protects consumers from hazards posed by consumer chemical products that are manufactured, imported, sold, or advertised in Canada. That's under the Consumer Product Safety Act. So those kinds of increased labeling requirements, which will cost millions and millions of dollars and not really producing any direct benefit in terms of human health or the environment. That's one of great concern to us.
Is there any other amendment that is alarming for you?
Well, there are 60 amendments that the cumulative effects proposal in terms of ensuring that all the cumulative effects are looked at in the assessment of chemicals. There are attempts to do that right now under the framework that exists. And, the government has the ability to invoke the precautionary principle based on certain parameters. So that framework it already exists, and we don't need to really codify any further in the bill.
In your testimony, again, you talk about that the government and your area, your companies, are working hand in hand to address some issue. Do you feel the same situation right now after the senators have made some amendment? Est-ce que vous avez le même sentiment de collaboration?
Do you have the same sense of collaboration with the government as with the amendments presented by the senators?
Can you
Okay.
read it in English, please?
In your testimony, dans votre témoignage,
In your testimony, you said that your industry and the government are generally working hand in hand to find solutions to the modern concerns that we have with these changes. Now, do you feel that the amendments put forward by the senators result in the work that you normally do hand in hand with the government not being honored, or that the amendments result in surprises with the new law that was proposed by the senators?
Now, we spend about 80% of our time with our staff to look at chemical assessment, the requirements, all the data requirements that the government imposes on us. We're compelled under the Act to provide that. What the senators are suggesting we do, that could cost, like the EU, for instance, they have thousands of chemicals assessed annually, and we hear at this committee on a regular basis that it is a better approach, whereas REACH over the past, since 2006, assessed 2,300 substances, whereas CMP addressed 4,230 substances. TSCA in the U.S. Did 10. We don't have the capacity ourselves to comply with all the extra requirement to submit data as some of those proposed amendments imply. And in Europe, they have hundreds of millions of dollars that they spend way beyond what Canada can spend. So we're going to be challenged there as well. We don't have that capacity now to get all the data we need without and not meeting targets at the same time. So we have very high requirements now, and that would only triple the work we do. And we can't keep up now. We're missing deadlines in terms of data submitted, and the assessors are missing deadlines in assessing the data. But we are trying to get the data. We think that substantive data is required to do a full and complete assessment.
you asked about other countries. Can you give us some example that if this bill is passed as it is with the amendment, you raised that in a few minutes ago, but how can you explain to us the difficulty that your business community will address if, based on the experience of other countries, if all those amendments are adopted?
Well, we had an example of that last week in Europe, where in 2021 they came forward with an assessment for TiO2, a substance that's been in place for many years. And the industry challenged it. They went to the European Court of Justice and was overturned last week. Now, that's a substance that's been around and understood, but they moved forward with a Category 2 carcinogen designation in the EU, and it was turned down. So, and that was based on only one study, or several very limited studies. Had it been looked at more substantively, maybe it would have proceeded further. But that's just a recent example of going too far, too fast, without the data you need. And it was turned down by the European Court of Justice. Under REACH.
I'm afraid you're out of time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you to all of our witnesses for their testimony. My first question is to Ms. Brown. Excuse me, Ms. Brown. We've had a number of delegations before us. First Nations delegations, inner city communities who have talked about pollution hotspots, where vulnerable populations have been exposed to toxic chemicals, often over decades. And those communities have raised with us the issue of community involvement. They want to be involved in biomonitoring. They want more transparency. And this certainly is a central theme of the CEPA that has been introduced, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. I wonder if you could please outline how we can better address discrimination, socioeconomic disparities, and other challenges as part of health protection, and whether you have any recommendations for improving the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Thank you for your question. And for us, without a doubt, is what we mean about removing some of those false boundaries, like those jurisdictional issues, are problematic. That, you know, we have industry surrounding all of our communities. And what's been happening here in our communities, that what we mean by the siloed approach, an abandoned mine. So we just focus on the coal mine and trying to find a resolve in terms of what are those toxins and how are they impacting our community. They don't take into account these other industries in the surrounding area. And for us, is that silo approach hasn't found any solutions. So that's what we mean about having to work together. How do we bring the municipality, the province, to work with the federal government to find some meaningful solutions? Because without it, it's just going to continue to escalate. And for us, it's like really, without a doubt, we're going to sacrifice a whole generation trying to find this resolve, because we're just impacted so intensely that it's really very frightening time for Nanaimo First Nation. So for us, is what is that going to take to look at us really meaningfully coming to the table with the same spirit and intent to save Mother Earth, the natural environment. It's not just Nanaimo, because it's those people living around our reserves that are also highly impacted.
Thank you for that. My next question is to Mr. Leroux. Mr. Leroux, we only had 3 minutes to allow you for testimony. I wonder if you could expand on confidential business information and some of your concerns. Certainly what's come up around the committee table is that there is a trust deficit. The reality is government isn't completely trusted by the people. Neither is business, frankly. It's been brought to our attention under the TUSCA, for instance, that audits have shown that 25-30% of confidential business information requests have really had no merit. I'm just wondering if there's some way to, and maybe it's through an audit system, to allow more transparency, but protect that critical innovation, information, IP that we know we need to make progress as a society.
Well, I think we trust government. If the government were to continue to honor the CBI system as it is in place now, I think that would work well. What we're concerned about is if you allow more openness, I suppose, if you will, sharing that information with competitors, sharing it with some that which would decrease competition. It would prevent those who do studies and research for even sustainable products to not ship those to Canada, because they would have to disclose the information that's confidential. And there are approaches now under ATIP and that kind of thing that you can access certain data, but I guess CBI would be cleared. I understand, yes, they do audits in the United States. I suppose that system, if it were deemed to be fair, would be an approach that we could.
I've just got a minute left, and I want to talk a little bit about timelines.
Sure.
I tend to focus on those issues where I obviously see tension and where perhaps we need to address issues that are coming up. One of them is timelines. There is, I've heard from folks on the industry side and from the environmental side that things take too long. And one of the issues that has been addressed by both of those communities is resourcing. Mm-hmm. And I think you would be in support of providing the resources needed to do those assessments in a timely manner, so that we get to the bottom of whether a chemical is safe sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we would support it. For sure. We have assessments now that drag on for a long period of time. It creates uncertainty for industry. So having more certainty would be better. We know that there are resource constraints imposed on government. I mean, if you look at our sector alone, we've had 23 chemical risk assessments and chemical risk management instruments already published. We're looking at 24 draft and final screening assessment reports now. And we have dozens more in terms of being looked at under SNAC.
We'll have to stop there. We'll go to Madame Posey.
That's a lot of work.
Oui,
I like that extra staff too.
Beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We spoke earlier, Mr. Chairman, and you were talking about no distribution of the notes. It's difficult, and I would just say that once again that the delay that was imposed and it was voted on 5-4 at the committee to study this means that we have fewer panel members. We voted that per hour there would be 4 witnesses, 1 coming from each party, and now this has been several times that we only have 3. We currently should have heard from 24 witnesses, and we've only heard from 20 on a bill that everyone is telling us is incredibly important to do a good analysis of. So I just really wanted to point that out again in a public meeting. Thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Brown, I'm going to turn to you for my first question, and it's concerning the right to a clean environment. Senior officials confirmed to us during a briefing that the bill does not create such a right, but that it's a principle, really, that should, in time, guide CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and that would only be defined in 2 years' time. Does your community believe that this provision, which is in the preamble of the bill, would concern the health of your community and that of the environment?
Sorry, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Can you repeat the question? I didn't understand the question.
Okay. What is it?
Go ahead. It's on the subject of the right to a healthy environment that is in the preamble of the bill. And so, in our opinion, it doesn't create a true right for you. So how do you see that? Is that provision in the preamble something that's really going to allow you to have an increased participation in these decisions?
Thank you. Yes, for us is like from our perspective is like really understanding and bringing our Indigenous voice forward. So that deeper understanding, that connectivity to the land is really key in terms of understanding what these issues are for the land itself. And that's where we've sort of misstep, focused on a scientific approach. So that's what we mean by being involved.
Non, tout à fait. J'aimerais.
Yes. So I'd like to come back to a witness that we heard from last week, Mr. Castilly, and it was a discussion about the transmission of pollution, of chemical pollution. He said that distributing or a known carcinogen from the air into the soil is not progress in the protection of human health or of the environment. So what are your concerns in reaction to that very sad finding?
Thank you. And that's really exactly what in our heart and our mind is, that we don't have that deeper understanding. We don't know if it's airborne, is coming in from the land, or if it's in the water, so that it's really true how it's impacting our health beyond a way that we can even identify possible solutions. So it's, for us, is what's really frightening. I hope people really understand that this inaction is really literally taking the lives of our community. That in our smallest community, like we're divided into 4 areas for our lived communities, our residency. Soon one of those villages will be a ghost town. That's how fast these toxins are moving. So we can't keep up. And that's when we think about and highlight that if we don't move now and do some immediate response and immediate screening, taking care of our community, we may lose a whole generation. So that's how we think about things back here in Nanaimo.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown, for that testimony. You spoke, in fact, in your opening statement that we need to work together, and I think that's very important indeed if we want to make progress. Mr. Leroux, earlier you said that there were countries that we could be inspired by and or that would be inspired by us. So I'm worried about those countries because we know that here in Canada, there are products that are in commerce before the end of their assessment, so before we know whether or not they're toxic, which means that we have these products in the environment. They might be dangerous to people's health, and they might be dangerous to the environment as well. So how do you see that exactly?
All products that are being assessed are in commerce now. Like there are a whole bunch that are prioritized for assessment under CEPA, under CMP. So they're presumed to be of concern, and that's what we're doing in CMP, and we're engaging with government on literally hundreds of products for our industry alone. So yes, we're trying to do the right thing because they have identified some things, some substances, ingredients used in our products that are of concern, and we're helping them with the data because we have lots of data under Section 71. We provide the data they need. Our industries are, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D, and they provide all that data to them. They're required by law to do so.
Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first questions are to Ms. Brown. Thank you so much for coming to speak about the impacts on the Snuneymuxw community, but also about the impacts on the land itself. You mentioned in your letter to the committee that it's a Snuneymuxw teaching to care for all and starting with the most vulnerable. And I appreciate your advocacy supporting Senator Mary Jane McCallum's amendment to include the word vulnerable environment. Can you speak a little bit more about the impact of resource extraction and development, whether that's from the port, logging and milling, historic coal mines, or waste management, on both the members of your community and on the land that your community has been stewarding for generations?
Thank you. And for us is that vulnerability is really critical, understanding that there's no separation between the land and the people themselves. So initially, from the beginning of time, our people really understood how to thrive and prosper when there was no toxin, no man-made harms in the community. But what we've lost along the way is really how to interpret those, what's going on for the land. And that's really been key, that the old people used to manage and steward the land in a way that she would never be harmed. They used to live in a delicate reciprocal relation, give and take. But now we're at a place where we've got to give more than we take. So that level of harm is really literally, she's, as I say once, I'll say a million times, she's on her last breath. She'll give till there's no more to give. So her vulnerability is those harms that we've caused. And it's the same with our people, that we're trying to endure, but we've lost those coping skills, our medicines, our culture, our language, that access to things that we need for ceremony. She's really very, very hollow right now. And so it's reflected in our way of being. So for us, we have to look at two approaches, one that's going to reclaim and restore our way of being in the same steps is taking that scientific, so we can really take a deeper dive so we all understand our role and our responsibility. That's the whole notion of multi-jurisdiction approach, that we can't blame. Otherwise, what have we solved? We're only continually perpetuating that cycle. So it's hard for people to understand what it means to work together the way that the old people did. So our vulnerability begins and starts with how we approach this. But we need to work together so that we can all move together in a good way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Madame Posey had asked you a question about the right to a healthy environment and about some of the concerns that this right might not be enforceable, that it's just in the preamble. I wanted to ask a question about expanding the right. I would really like to see this right apply to future generations. And I'm curious about your thoughts about expanding the right to a healthy environment to include future generations as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really key. And thank you for restating that question, because from a multi-generational approach, that we realize that our responsibility is to make sure that the future generations begin to understand and embrace this way of being. So enforcing and impacting is in our hearts and mind, moving from a sense of entitlement to a sense of responsibility. That's really critical from that enforcement lens, understanding that the role and responsibility of each and every one of us, that's especially for the younger generations, because we've lost things. The generation before me were the last fluent speakers, but now it's even more critical that the younger generations begin to understand how to steward the land in a really meaningful way, that the land has to walk first in everything that we do. She has her rights and her responsibilities to thrive and get back to a place where she's our first teacher and our first healer.
Thank you so much. Now, one of the other witnesses mentioned Section 6. This section opens up the possibility of tackling some of the concerns that people have around genetically modified organisms. This can have a really big impact on salmon. And I've heard from a number of First Nation leaders in British Columbia about concerns that they have around genetically modified salmon, about companies patenting the DNA of salmon. And I'm just curious, Ms. Brown, if you have any concerns or if you've heard about this or if your community is at all concerned about what's been happening with genetically modified salmon.
Yes, for sure. We have the same concerns. For us, it's really that, the salmon people are our most sacred relatives. And so that just to alter their natural way of being is no different than altering our way of being. So we really try to promote and protect the natural environment and especially her own being. It's just really, that's her strength, that's her resiliency. And we want to maintain and protect that with every strength, every fiber of our being, just like every other First Nation. It's going to cause harm to us. People don't understand that salmon is more than sustenance. It's really part of our overall wellness. And an example is that in terms of ceremony, they're the ones that break a fast. So just really critical to ceremony. So without a doubt,
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chair, do I have any time left? Okay, well, maybe just to Ms. Mitchell, if you have anything follow-ups on genetically modified salmon.
Absolutely. So, animal justice has a number of concerns, and I think that the GM salmon case exemplifies really the overall problems with Part 6. Some of them are very specific in terms of how the assessment there was done, and some are more overarching. As you've heard, we did not consider the impact on Indigenous peoples. We also did not consider the welfare of the salmon. SEPA treats genetically modified organisms the same way that it treats chemical substances. So I think it's really alarming, and I think that it really shows the need for a comprehensive overhaul of that part, but also in the meantime to make some amendments to improve it while we're waiting for that overhaul.
Thank you. I will go to Mr. McLean now for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues, witnesses. Thank you for everything you presented to us here today. My first question is going to go to Ms. Mitchell as well. Ms. Mitchell, thank you very much for your advocacy for animals and the fact that we should do everything we can so that they're not suffering in the testing that we do for our own needs. But I did have a question for you on the Section 6 of SEPA changes because the way it's worded is SEPA addresses living organisms where a living organism is defined as a substance that is an animate product of biotechnology, and then it gives the minister the authority to examine whether any new animate product of biotechnology is necessary or not. Is it, in your opinion, the minister's purview, and obviously with his officials, to see whether determine whether a product is necessary or not, or is that something that is naturally evolving as we go through this? And I'd really like your input on it because it is a gap I think we have so far. And any suggestion you might have about how to regulate that more appropriately would also be appreciated.
Yes, thank you for the question. So what I would say about that is that, when we talk about genetically modified organisms, and of course, my interest is in genetically modified animals in particular, it raises a number of issues, some of which are ethical, some of which are environmental, some of which are human health, some of which have to do with animals. And so I think that, the question that you've raised really crosses all of those boundaries. And so certainly I think that there is room in SEPA for the minister to take a more comprehensive approach to evaluating these products. We haven't specifically advocated for, one approach or another, although I understand that the Senate did pass the amendment that you spoke to. What I would say about Part 6, though, is that, for all of these reasons, I think that most stakeholders agree we do need comprehensive review of that part. And I understand that, we're not doing it right now, which is disappointing, and it's also challenging because, we have these specific amendments the Senate put forward, and the question is, do we keep those in now or do we hold off on in terms of a broader review? But I do think that for the most part, the Senate's amendments do start to move us in the right direction, and as mentioned in my brief, we additionally would like to see some regulation making authority for animals.
Thank you very much, Ms. Would you be able to take it upon yourself to actually provide us with some language post your testimony here about how that legislation might be better worded to protect against what we're looking for? Would that be something you could take on?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I would
Okay.
say, I was involved in the genetically modified salmon litigation, so I have a lot of views on that topic. I'm very happy to do that.
Very much. My next question is for Mr. Leroux. Mr. Leroux, one of the issues in here, of course, is the issue along confidential business information. We've had input from other actors that are being affected by this, and that balance that we're going to have as far as what confidential business information should be provided to the government and the government to provide it to all of the parties at this point in time. That may lead to, of course, industry, businesses leaving this jurisdiction for more opportunities in other jurisdictions. Can you tell us how you see that sharing of confidential information blanket would affect your operations here in Canada?
Well, it affects us a lot because it's already happening. 50% of our products now sold in Canada are shipped to Canada over the border. Manufacturing has been leaving Canada, right? So their products are being shipped here. 20 years ago, there was 30%. Now it's 50, and it could be even higher. Some manufacturers don't have facilities in Canada. They're just putting on a truck and shipping it to Canada from plants in the United States. That's happening across the board. Consolidation is doing that. So this is going to make that even tougher because most of their products are coming from companies based in the United States. So they're giving their information to Canadian authorities.
But when those chemicals come into Canada, they're still regulated.
They're still regulated, 100% regulated.
Yeah, but they're regulated to the same standard.
Right. And you're not going to have all the information, new information, new chemistries, and new innovation that we would have here in Canada. We would have to import that or buy it in higher priced products.
And would we be subject to the regulations and the oversight that would happen in those other jurisdictions at that point?
Yes.
And those jurisdictions have so far, the United States, for example, much softer oversight mechanisms than are in CEPA or even in these ones. So,
well, you don't want to put a sign up at the border saying no innovation in Canada. That impacts.
No, it's not the no innovation. It's the whole issue about where do you do business because effectively it's the same consumer at the end of the day.
We'll have to stop there. Yeah, we'll go Ms. Taylor-Roy, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I'd like to start my questioning with Ms. Mitchell regarding some of the suggested amendments you've made. And thank you very much for your thorough work on this. It's an issue of great concern to me, too. I was wondering first that there is a difference between something the Canadian Centre for Alternatives in Animal Testing had put forward and something you put forward on animal testing. And I was just wondering, the issue of removing or including refined in the legislation. And the reason I'm asking about this is because I know you'd like to have this removed and just put in replace or reduce, but there is still certain tests where there are no alternatives to animal testing. And in the interim, when these still have to be, unfortunately, put forward through animal testing or tested through animal testing, do you not feel that having that refined part in there would help with the animal welfare during these tests?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I appreciate, this is a challenging topic for the reasons that you outlined. So our position is that the overall emphasis of the Act needs to be on replacing and reducing animals and not just refining the way they're used. But as you know, they'll still be used in science, and I take that point. So what I've proposed in the brief is that at the very least, perhaps what we could do is take that out of the preamble and section 2, because those are sort of these visionary provisions and have those focus on replacement of animals entirely and allow for refinement to come in other places. So I do think I have great respect for Dr. Chandrasekhara, and I do also think that the proposal that she put forward around, restraining what refinement looks like could also have the same effect.
Okay, very good. And another question is regarding the recommendation 4 you made, the amendment to the new section 2(1)(c)(1), and you said to encourage the development of scientifically justified alternative methods and strategies in the testing and assessment of substances to replace or reduce. Okay, but then you also added at the end, requires the timely incorporation of those methods and strategies as well. And could you just elaborate on why you believe that additional wording is necessary and what effect that would have?
Yes, thank you. So the proposal there is really just to try to strengthen the wording a bit. The language that was originally proposed in the Senate would have required government to avoid the use of animals. And instead, we've got the word encouraging that was introduced because it's less strong. And so, I agree, encourage is less strong than avoid. So really, my purpose there was saying, at least let's require timely incorporation, is that there's a little bit stronger wording there to make sure that we really are moving in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much. And I also had a question for Ms. Brown. I was actually, you talked about the kind of the kind of cooperation, multi-jurisdictional cooperation. And in S5, there's an emphasis on a right to a healthy environment that includes explicit language to align the Act with UNDRIP. And the proposed Senate amendments also make reference to the need to consult and engage with Indigenous peoples on environmental protection. So in your view, does this provide sufficient opportunity to have these multi-jurisdictional conversations, or do you think there are other things that have to be added to strengthen it?
Thank you for that question. And so to consult and engage is really kind of just a surface. For us is really one, to take a lead and make sure that it's taken an Indigenous approach. So that's really, to us, is key in terms of having a high impact. And I think that's one of the missing ingredients for everything that we're doing in terms of the environment, like that, that understanding how things are interconnected and how things play out that's really key. You can't talk about the estuary without talking about the river and the seaway and so on and so forth. So that's really a whole system. And again, repeating myself, but that siloed approach is really problematic. So it's not enough to engage us or consult us, but really ask us to take the lead, because we're the ones that know the land and really can help each of us understand where's the core of the problem, because it's really taking its own life, its own energy, and we have to react in a much different way.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
well,
Thank you.
unfortunately, we're out of time, Ms. Taylor-Roy, but there'll be other opportunities, I'm sure. But Madame Posé.
Ms. Posé, for 2.5 minutes, please. Yes. I'd like to come back to you, Mr. Leroux. First of all, I'd just like a clarification. Did you say that imported products have the same standards of Canadian ones, yes or no?
C'est pas ça que vous avez dit.
Okay.
OK.
Mr. McLean's
Oui,
question.
suite à une question.
Yes, following a question from Mr. McLean.
Okay.
In terms of CBI, they need the protection in Canada. When they ship products to Canada and they share information with the government, they would like to have confidential business information strong.
D'accord, merci.
Okay, thank you. You say, and you said in your introduction in your notes, that you would support a CEPA change that would be built on prevention, if I understood correctly. So do you support an approach by family groups of substances as is done in Europe? So rather than taking one single substance at a time, taking groups of them together, it means that it would be a lot faster.
Done. They do it under CMP. Now, groups of substances is a part of the assessment process already. Under CMP, we've had a number of those.
Écoutez,
As far as I know, it's really one substance at a time. It's not by groups of substances or families of substances.
OK, vous avez eu des cas, ce n'est donc pas
So you've had cases. It's not systematic. because earlier you said, to my previous question, you said that you're working on the assessment of substances, but it's because there are some that are already in commerce before the assessment is completed, which is putting people at risk, potentially, either their health or the environment.
Now for assessment are in commerce. They're being sold. The whole idea is to look at the inputs in those chemicals to make sure they're not harmful to human health or the environment. It's an ongoing process under CMP.
Earlier, you spoke about the fact that it's a lengthy process. You can't assess many. Could we not cooperate or collaborate with data that we already see in countries that have similar data to ours and work with them rather than redoing all of these assessments?
At most.
Well, Canada has a more rigorous process than the EU, for instance. They do summaries of studies. Like I mentioned, the TiO2 that was just knocked down by the European Court of Justice. They had very limited data. That's why it didn't proceed. So we have much more substantive data in many cases, and we don't have summary data. They don't use standardized data in Europe.
We'll go to Ms. Collins now, please.
And my questions are for Ms. Mitchell. You mentioned octopuses in your opening statement, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the use of the language vertebrate animals. Cephalopods can solve complex puzzles. They can learn and remember. Octopuses have been known to use tools and recognize individuals outside their species, including human faces. They're an interesting example of advanced cognitive evolution in animals. And yeah, just wanted to hear more of your thoughts on this.
Absolutely, and thank you for that opportunity. So, as you recognize, the Act right now focuses exclusively on vertebrates, but of course, and especially hopefully members of the committee have seen My Octopus Teacher in particular, which recently came out and really showed how highly intelligent those animals are. So what we're proposing right now is that we recognize that toxicity testing right now is being done on invertebrates. However, we don't know what direction science is going to go in, and we do know that octopuses are increasingly being used in research around the world. So what we've proposed is really just to create the option to create regulations in the future if needed, not to protect all invertebrates. We're not suggesting to, protect, very small microorganisms. We're saying to protect animals that we know to be sentient and complex, like the octopus. And we think it's really important to put it in there, especially because who knows when SEPA will be reviewed again. It could be another 20 years.
Thank you so much. And you also mentioned the 2035 timeline for phasing out animal testing. Can you talk a little bit about whether you think Canada is on track and if there's a danger of us not meeting that deadline, and what really needs to happen for us to make sure we meet it?
Yeah, I would say right now Canada is not on track, but I think we could be. And so that's the good news. I try to look at these things in an optimistic way. So the bad news is we're behind other jurisdictions. The good news is because of that, we can learn from them. So we can look to the United States, for instance. They have a similar 2035 deadline, and we can see what worked there. And part of that is through their TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. They have requirements to reduce and replace to the extent practicable and scientifically justified the use of animals. There's also a planning requirement, and I think that's really important. This planning requirement to actually get us on track and make sure that we're being thoughtful and strategic and thinking through how to actually achieve the deadline. So we're very pleased that that's been included by the Senate in Section 73, and we'd really like to see that stay.
Thank you. Mr. Benson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Mr. Leroux, earlier submissions by organizations linked to the Chemistry Association of Canada had concerns with the proposed watch list, namely redundancy and a lack of clarity regarding the delisting of substances. Does the CPCA share any of those concerns?
Put substances on a watch list, it just signals to Canadians that these chemicals shouldn't be in products that they buy. So that causes them concern, and there's no control of how many substances are placed on that watch list or any protocol to get them to the watch list or even get them off. So we prefer that there be no watch list. It's like Hotel California. You can enter, but you can never leave. You're stuck on that list, and we don't know how long it's going to grow, and how it will be detrimental to. And it also sends a signal to Canadians or consumers that the government's regulations for products now don't work. If they got to do something post a regulation to say to consumers that there are also these that are potentially harmful 10 years, 20 years, 40 years out. So that doesn't give much confidence in the current regulations of the federal government.
Okay. Currently, there are over 50,000 CEPA regulations in place, and no question there's going to be more regulations coming. You've hinted or suggested that some of these are going to have economic harm to the coatings and manufacturing sectors in Canada. So I know you don't want to be using chemicals that are toxic or unhealthy, but how do we find the balance between having companies that are innovating, introducing new products, solving problems for Canadians, but having to deal with all this extra cost that's being put on the industry? Is it possible to find a balance there?
In terms of new products being developed, you mean?
Well, I just mean that we've got a lot of 50,000 CEPA regulations is a tremendous burden on any company or any industry to have to work with all of that. That brings enormous cost.
Yes.
That cost eventually has to be passed on to consumers.
Right.
Or we don't have the product, or we're looking to other jurisdictions to create the product. So I'm just asking, in a Canadian environment, how do we deal with all of these regulations and still try to have a healthy industry that's profitable, but also healthy from the point of view of the environment? How do we find the balance between all of that in terms of how we're dealing with C5?
Yeah. Well, many of the chemical regulations are redundant. I mean, the Treasury Board study talked about those a few years ago, I think, and came out with a study that said a lot of them would be removed because they're not even used anymore. But the ones that we have to comply with, I mean, I don't think our industry is complaining about complying with regulations. We want fair regulations. We want understanding of how they're going to help the environment and human health. We're all supportive of that, as we've been engaged, as I said previously, with a huge amount of engagement with the government on like 500 substances just in the last 5 years. So we're not saying that these are not necessary. We're saying that they need to be done in a fair process that's evidence-based, based on the science, and even our American friends. A lot of what we do is encourage compliance with our members in Canada and the U.S. to provide the data that government needs to do the assessment. And once that is done, we're ensuring compliance is maintained with our members who operate in this country. So I don't think we're saying too many regulations per se, although it has, because of the preponderance, it's the straw that broke the camel's back. We have companies that have moved production out of Canada. That's a fact. They only have distribution centers. So their jobs are not here, but they're still, their volume of sales going up. So that's not a good sign for Canada ultimately for the long run.
Okay, thank you.
You have about 20 seconds, Mr. Benson.
I just quick question for Mrs. Mitchell. You said that these alternative testing methods are less expensive and they're quicker, and yet we still had 90,000 animals being used last year for live testing. So obviously the results aren't quite there in terms of what organizations are looking for. What's the timeline or estimated timeline where these alternative testing methods results will equal or match or exceed the results we're getting from using live animals?
Unfortunately, we've really gone over time. Maybe Mr. Longfield will ask the same question, or not putting words in your mouth, Mr. Longfield.
Mr.
Yeah, no. Anyway, it's up to you. You're next, Mr. Longfield.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And at this stage of the meeting, a lot of the questions have been asked. Maybe I would like to extend on the question that Ms. Mitchell just got from Mr. Benson. But my question at the end of that would be, what's slowing down the conversion and going from animal-based testing to the testing that Dr. Shakira gave us?
Yeah, and it's a complicated question, and I'm not sure that I have the answer as a lawyer. But what I would say is that this is a system-based problem, right? We have systems in place that rely on these historic animal tests, and so it just takes time to move away from them. And in part, also it requires upfront investment in developing those non-animal methods. Once they're developed, as I said, I think that they have tremendous benefits, but it's also that upfront investment piece that I think Canada needs to get serious about, because other countries like the EU, or jurisdictions I should say, and the US, they are serious about it and they're putting the money there. And so I think Canada needs to do that in addition to strengthening the law itself to move us in that direction.
Thank you. Quite often it does come down to resources. And I did have a conversation with one of my constituents today for about a half an hour on this topic. She was very well briefed on S5. One area that we talked about that I was pushing back on a bit is in terms of CRISPR technology and in terms of genetics as a way to combat antimicrobial resistance, to use less chemicals when you're caring for animals by using gene modification. It gets into a very gray zone in a hurry when you get into what research is going on with animals. Do you have any comment on that?
Absolutely. So our position on Part 6 at this time is that at the very least, what we need are regulations to protect animals. We know that attempts to modify the genetic makeup of animals, including CRISPR, can actually have very serious, unexpected, and unpredictable negative implications for their welfare. So at this point, we're not suggesting that we can't do those types of things if and when they're needed and if and when, they've been fully assessed. Our point is merely if we're going to start to modify animals' genetic makeup, let's make sure that that is not actually going to cause them health and welfare implications. And again, because of other jurisdictions being ahead, we can look to the EU, for instance. That's a really good example about how to do that.
Yes, thank you. And just looking at time clicking by quickly, I'd like to go over to Mr. Leroux. When the Senate committee looked at clause 15 of the bill, they replaced the phrase poses the highest risk with the phrase it's carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic to reproduction, or poses other risks of highest concern. By focusing on concern rather than risk, the amendment is actually looking at putting at risk or undermining the risk-based approach to chemicals management under SEPA. Could you comment on the importance of ensuring that we're careful with the language we use so that we don't undermine the risk-based approach that we are going for?
Well, I think the whole chemical assessment process is risk-based in Canada, and I think we should stay with that. I mean, they have a hazard-based approach in the EU, and they've not been gone through as many chemicals assessed as Canada has in the last since 2006. So clearly, we still have substantive data, and we want to ensure that we deal with the risk. It's a much longer and more involved process to do a hazard-based assessment, and so far we haven't done that here, and we hope that Canada will stay with a risk-based approach going forward.
And I noticed even in my question how much I was using the word risk, because any change involves risk, and we're trying to improve our environmental performance, but we're doing that through risk analysis. Mm-hmm. And we found that we have been successful in the past because of that. Is that paraphrased?
I would agree with that.
Okay. Thank you. And Ms. Brown, in less than a minute, I am concerned about us.
This is the 5-minute round, Mr. Longview.
Okay, going against the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by introducing another type of review that SEPA would use with Indigenous people. You mentioned taking the lead in your previous comments. how would a meaningful review process look from your community?
Yeah, we're kind of out of time. Maybe just very quickly, Ms. Brown, like in 15 seconds.
The cumulative impact, like assessing it from a whole system approach, is really key. Looking at all of the toxins that are coming in from numerous industries is
Succinct answer, very good succinct answer. Thank you. Alors, merci à nos...
I thank our witnesses, and I thank the members of the committee for their very good questions. We've had a very enriching conversation. We'll have to stop now and have a short break to connect our second panel. So thank you once again to the witnesses, and we'll suspend.
We'll get moving now on to the second panel. I'm told that Ms. Riston, we have Ms. Coombs, Shannon Coombs from the Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association. From Crop Life, we have Ian Affleck and Dr. Justine Taylor. From the Living Oceans Society, we have Karen Riston, who may be joining a bit later. There's an issue with time change, but we'll start for 3 minutes with Ms. Coombs, please. Ms. Coombs, go ahead.
Good day, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here to provide our perspective on the committee's review of ESFI. My name is Shannon Coombs, and I'm the president of the Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association. And for 24 years, I have proudly represented the many accomplishments of this proactive and responsible industry. And for 19 of those, I've been president. The last 2 years of my tenure at CCSPA has been a very challenging yet rewarding time for industry and government, as we have collectively delivered disinfectants, sanitizers, hand sanitizers, plus general cleaners to ensure Canadians had the products they needed to keep them safe, whether it was in their home, their workplace, and schools. I would like to thank all the members of the committee who follow us on Twitter and have retweeted us in the last 32 months as we promoted hand washing and numerous important COVID advisories, and most recently the monkeypox during this unprecedented time. Getting good, factual, and useful information to Canadians during the pandemic was and is key a priority for the association. Today, I'd like to offer a quick outline of how the Act works for our industry, the success of the world-leading program, the CMP, and our support for moving forward. Why is CEPA important to CCSPA and our members? It's a sophisticated 400-piece page of legislation. And in 1999, after an exhaustive review of your predecessors in this very forum, very few months in the industry, the Environment Committee reviewed over 550 proposed amendments, of which 150 were included in the final bill after 93 hours of review. As a result, it has led to some significant outcomes for Canadians. One such outcome is the Chemicals Management Plan, referred to as a CMP, which is a science-based risk assessment program for chemicals and their management. In short, CEPA governs our ingredients, both existing and new. CCSPA has supported this world-leading government program since 2006, and we have strived to ensure our pillars of sound science, due process, and effective communications have been embraced in the program. Canadians should be proud of this program. Our country is a global leader in how substances are assessed and managed, regardless of where that chemical is used. We were very pleased to see S5 tabled on February the 9th in the Senate. The package at the time was a thoughtful proposal of many views, including the 2006 and 2016 parliamentary reviews. Current policies are being codified, and there's some bold thinking to modernize the Act. So what does it codify? A right to the healthy environment, vulnerable populations, and cumulative effects, and information regarding the risks of toxic substances, including labeling. And so what are some of the new amendments? The use of the Best Place Act, Best Place Minister, and the list of substances of becoming toxic, unfortunately misnamed the watch list. In the Senate, 2 additional amendments were included. In our opinion, one is outside the scope of S5 and one adds some regulatory red tape. CCSPA would ask ENVI to consider removing the following: 67, which is the requirement for industry, I said, to test imported products to ensure that they meet Canadian regulations and to prepare a report to Parliament, and Section 13.1 requiring a database of all actions related to 30,000 chemicals. In closing, I'd like to state that CCSPA has been and remains committed to working with this government on supporting an efficient and effective piece of legislation and the regulatory frameworks. The bill continues to strike an important balance of codifying important principles, and the health and safety in Canadians and our environment remains paramount.
Thanks very much. Nice to see you again. I know you've been with the organization for a number of years, and we've interacted before on different other related issues. So for Crop Life, who will be speaking? Mr. Affleck, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Ian Affleck. I'm the Vice President of Plant Biotechnology for Crop Life Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Justine Taylor, Director of Stewardship and Sustainability. Crop Life Canada is the association representing the manufacturers, developers, and distributors of plant science innovations, including pest control products and plant biotechnology for use in agriculture, urban, and public health settings. We're committed to protecting human health and the environment, and we believe in driving innovation through continuous research. Our members bring innovation to Canadian farmers, and those innovations help drive improved productivity and sustainability. For example, these innovations supported farmers in reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of Canadian agriculture by 50% since 1997. The average Canadian farm is now producing twice as much food as it did 50 years ago while using the same amount of inputs. Simply put, these technologies allow farmers to grow more food on less land using fewer resources, all while making agriculture more sustainable, keeping food prices more affordable, and growing the economy. The legislative framework being discussed today in Canada plays a critical role in fostering innovation and directly impacts whether these solutions make it into the hands of Canadian farmers. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is a critical piece of that framework, which has historically delivered world-leading environmental protection while also delivering a predictable, science, and risk-based approach to regulatory oversight. While Crop Life Canada member products are primarily regulated under CEPA equivalent acts and regulations such as the Pest Control Products Act, Feeds Act, and Seeds Act, amendments to CEPA have the potential to impact those regulatory programs. Crop Life Canada and its members are supportive of amendments to CEPA as tabled on February 9th, 2022. However, we're only supportive of 2 of the amendments that were proposed following the clause-by-clause review through the Senate committee, and specifically, those are related to replacing, reducing, refining the use of vertebrate animals in testing procedures, and engagement of Indigenous communities. With that in mind, the original bill, S5, offered a well-balanced and pragmatic approach to addressing identified shortcomings in CEPA while preserving the essential science and risk-based approach to regulation for which Canada is known. Crop Life Canada, on behalf of its members, respectfully requests that the bill be returned to its original state, other than those 2 Senate amendments noted above. This will help ensure the safety of Canadians and their environment while providing a predictable, science and risk-based legislative foundation for the regulation of new and innovative products like those delivered by our member companies. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Affleck. So we'll go to Mr. Couric.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Would you just mind letting the committee know what time Karen Weston is expected?
Do you have that answer? I don't think. I think we're trying. We're not. I think there was a confusion around time zones.
And I'm wondering if we could potentially switch the order so that I ask my questions later in the evening, as I have a number of questions for that witness.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Couric for 6 minutes.
Thank you very, very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses who are appearing here today. And let me preface my questions by simply saying, time is something that we are in short supply of. So if there is further information needed, please feel free to follow up with this committee, whether that be specific amendments, further information regarding your comments. As somebody who is very involved in agriculture, I'd have a lot of questions related to that, but to keep it directly associated with S5, you talked about the need to find the right balance. Chemicals are an important part of agriculture in Canada, and you talked about needing that balance and how both CEPA and other related acts have a significant effect on that. I'd invite you to expand on the specifics of what that balance should look like and how important that is that we strike that balance here today.
Thank you. I think the key to that is the risk-based approach. When we allow and provide the support for the departments to complete risk-based oversight of new products when they deem necessary, that's what creates that balance of ensuring it's a robust science-based decision that determines whether a product is or is not suitable and how and the limitations to which it's used. So I really think, in a short answer, maintaining the very risk-based approach and avoiding a hazard-based approach is critical to having that balance.
So we've heard quite a bit about that, and especially stakeholders who have suggested that move is problematic. So, but as like is the case in agriculture, and a lot of sometimes misunderstanding associated with whether it be the use of chemicals or in the case of fertilizer, in the case of agriculture, fertilizers and whatnot. I'm wondering. So you're talking about risk-based approach. How does that encompass ensuring that products are in fact safe when being applied to agricultural products and processes and some things that ultimately end up in the Canadian food supply chain?
I think that's when we look at the history of our food supply chain, it's been incredibly safe, and those risk-based approaches have done a great job of ensuring that the food on Canadian shelves is safe for the consumer as well as safe for the environment when it's being produced. I think that difference between hazard and risk-based, a good example would be wood dust is a Class 1 carcinogen, so it's a hazard. But I don't think we would see the need for wood dust to fall under a complicated regulatory scheme of how it's used on a farm or how it's managed. So if you move to hazard-based, you're going to capture a lot of things that could be a hazard, but that's the key to risk, is the exposure is what matters. How are you exposed to that hazard? And then allowing the flexibility for the departments to draw that line of when they need to see a product, because they live in that space and they understand when they need to capture something for review and when something is benign, a hazard that is benign, that can just move freely into the marketplace.
So you'd address the two Senate amendments that you support, and I know we've heard a lot of conversations around that. In terms of the other subject matter of the bill, is there anything that you would like to highlight for the committee to ensure that we have a better understanding of some of the impacts that might have on you and the ag industry in general?
There's many that's been well addressed by previous witnesses, but if I was to pick two that I think highlight for us, which are primarily managed under equivalent acts. One would be demonstrable need. Again, looping back to the risk-based approach, demonstrable need would not be embedded in a risk-based approach. That would be a nebulous and undefined space of what is demonstrable need. So that would move us away from a global risk-based approach. The other would be our approach to confidential business information, and just assuring that we're internationally aligned in how we do that so that we don't put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage compared to the rest of the world. And with that, I would say, often the drive for additional transparency on CBI is around a belief that will create public trust. And I think what's important is not the raw data, It's the explanation of our regulatory processes by our government to our citizens and explaining this is how we came to our decision. Here's the summary of what we reviewed, because most people won't know what to do with 700 pages of toxicology data. They want to understand what it meant, how it was well reviewed, and what the outcome of that was. So you can still get to transparency and trust without damaging competitiveness in the marketplace. There's a balance.
So, and especially when it comes to things like competitiveness, we've heard from a number of witnesses that if we don't get this right, we'll see capital flight, we'll see industry and manufacturing leave Canada. Just wondering if you'd have any comments about the possible impact to the Canadian economy and your industry in particular if we don't get that balance right.
I think there would be clear detriment to the Canadian economy. I think one right now we're working through equivalent acts on plant breeding innovation guidance, which is central to how gene editing will be managed by the government. We are 8 years behind Argentina in figuring that out, and they've seen significant increases in their R&D from small and large companies. We're 4 years behind the U.S. We're 3 years behind Australia. Important that we get it right, but others have gotten it right before us. And we're seeing the proofs in the pudding that they're getting the investment.
No, I appreciate that. And just to wrap up my time, I would say that you highlighted very well the value of agriculture, and especially when we have incredible innovations that have taken place over the last century or so, the inputs versus yields, and the absolutely massive potential that exists within the space in Canada. So with that, thank you, Chair.
Avant cette tournée.
Before turning to Mr. Wilder, I want to tell you that Ms. Riston is now connected. So I would ask her to now make her presentation for 3 minutes. And Ms. Riston, before beginning, if you could move your microphone up a little higher.
Push the microphone up a bit so that it's not, a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's pretty good, yeah. Excellent, thank you. Go ahead for 3 minutes, please. You're on mute, though. I think you're on mute.
I wonder what else I could do wrong this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address you on SEPA. Living Oceans Society is a nonprofit dedicated to ecosystem-based management of Canada's oceans. I serve as its executive director. It's been 22 years since the Act came into force, and during that time, genetic engineering has developed with very little public consultation or oversight. The introduction of GM animals into the food supply and into the environment raises questions of ethics, health, and safety that are matters of profound public interest. Yet Part 6 of SEPA suffers from a lack of transparency and opportunity for public input that's striking in comparison with other Canadian legislation. I'd like to illustrate that point by describing our experience of trying to participate in the approval of the world's first genetically modified food animal, AquaBounty's Aqua Advantage salmon, or AAS. We have concerns for the damage to the habitat and genetic integrity of endangered wild Atlantic salmon should AAS eggs or the brood fish from which they were produced escape into the environment. Our concerns are shared by fishermen, First Nations, social justice, and conservation groups. Requests made to health and environment ministries for information were refused point blank. Everything we learned about the Canadian government's process for approving the manufacture and sale of AAS, we learned through the US government, through filings made by the company in the US. Health Canada's reply acknowledged that this matter is one of significant public interest, but advised, quote, "As you may know, the department is not legally permitted to release information that companies submit and consider confidential. This includes even the mere fact that a submission to the department has been made." The letter went on to suggest that media coverage of the issue was adequate notice to Canadians. We filed for judicial review, and we filed an access to information request to see the risk assessment that had been done. The document that was ultimately produced was very long, but there wasn't much to read in it. It was mostly redacted. It transpired that Health Canada had waived the requirement for a toxicity assessment with no notice to the public. The risk assessment confirmed that the environmental hazard of a release from the facility was high, but made a finding of SEPA non-toxic, provided that the activity was confined to the quantities assessed to be produced in the PEI facility, and that the manufactured eggs were exported to Panama for grow out, where the environmental risk of release was considered low. All of those conditions were dropped when the government issued its significant new activity notice. This opened the door to AAS being manufactured in any contained facility in any quantity for grow out anywhere without a risk assessment that justified the finding of not SEPA toxic in all of those eventualities. As it stands today, SEPA permits all of the aforementioned process to take place in absolute secrecy with no opportunity for
Thank you. We'll have to stop there, but there'll be time for questions and answers. So we'll go to Mr. Weiler now for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here with us today.
Today, I'd like to ask to Ms. Riston, and thank you for joining today for the work that you do and that Living Ocean Society has been doing for decades now to ensure that we do have a healthy marine environment and a thriving and sustainable blue economy. And we know how important that work is, especially today, as we, amongst other things, see the major stresses that wild Pacific salmon are facing in BC. But this in mind, I take your comments regarding the genetic engineering to heart. But in this committee, we've heard concerns from several witnesses, including Mr. Affleck, who's here today, that about the Senate amendment requiring that the minister make a determination that there is demonstrable need for a new living organism being a deviation from the risk-based approach of SEPA. So I was hoping you could make the case to this committee for why the committee should consider the departure from this approach when it comes to new living organisms, given the profound concerns that you've raised and the example that you spoke about earlier.
Yes, thank you for the question. I should begin by saying that the need to demonstrate need for the living organism isn't a departure from the risk assessment. It's in addition to the risk assessment. Let's just be clear on that. We do need definitely to have risk assessments. But when we think about living organisms that have wild counterparts, there are considerations that go far beyond the purview of those doing the risk assessment. Those are considerations of social, cultural, and economic nature that are held by, in the case of the Aqua Advantage salmon, First Nations, who fear for the cultural integrity of their peoples if the salmon are lost, and by fishermen who fear for the genetic integrity and resilience of the stocks. There's an even better example of why we should think about demonstrable need, and that is the aquarium glowfish that has now colonized rivers throughout Brazil. It's a small thing. Nobody knows what damage it's doing in the environment, but it has literally colonized rivers throughout that country. It's been spotted in rivers elsewhere. Did we need to put nature at risk to that extent in order to make a colored aquarium fish? That is a poster case, I would say, of a situation where demonstrable need ought to have been demonstrated.
Thank you for that. You also mentioned some concerns specifically about the Aqua Bounty salmon that went through a process that you participated in directly. And I think with this in mind, there was some amendments that were made by the Senate as part of their process, particularly that addresses public participation, that now requires, as part of Section 108, that the minister will ensure that the public is provided with opportunities to participate meaningfully in the assessment, and that public comments shall be solicited as part of that in respect to the testing of all the evidence. And that they can request additional evidence from any individual. So with this in mind, I was hoping you could comment on those amendments that have been made and if they satisfy some of the concerns that you've raised with the committee here today.
They do go a great distance to satisfying those concerns. I am aware that Nature Canada has filed or is about to file a brief with you in which they detail some slight tweaks to the language that would make it even more clear exactly what it is we want. and I would just commend those amendments to you when you receive them.
Thank you very much. And from next, I'd like to turn to Mr. Affleck. You mentioned in your opening about two of the amendments that the Senate made that you were in support of, but that you had concerns with other ones that or rather all of the other ones that were made by the Senate. And I was hoping you could speak to some of those specifically, just to highlight some of the concerns that CropLife has with the amendments that the Senate has made at this point.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the key point there is, while we're concerned about the amendments from the Senate, we're supportive of the amendments to SEPA in the originally tabled bill, which were significant in number and to make SEPA even more robust than it was when it entered the process. I think I mentioned two. One was the demonstrable need piece. The other was some of the provisions around CBI. I think the other portions where the watch list was another example where there's current mechanisms within departments to deal with that through significant new activity notices. So this would be somewhat redundant to activities that already exist. And I think throughout the amendments, there were a number that moved us away from the risk-based into a hazard-based approach, or adding elements into the discussion that were not science and risk-based. So it was a long suite of amendments from the Senate, so and many that aren't directly impactful to our industry, so I would hesitate to go through others, but those are a few of the highlights, in my opinion.
We've got about 10 seconds, Mr. Weiler.
Oh, I'll cede the last 10 seconds.
Thanks.
Ms. Posey for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us here today at this late hour. Mr. Affleck, you know that there is a risk that exists that genetically modified organisms could find themselves in the environment.
Placed into the
Non,
environment.
pas délibérément, mais qu'ils...
No, not deliberately, but that they may find themselves in the environment.
A genetically modified plant?
Well, I'm following up really on what Ms. Cameron said earlier concerning animals that have been genetically modified and that may find themselves in the environment, and they go out into nature and they reproduce. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, CropLife Canada focuses on plant-based biotechnology. So in our space, we are deliberately bringing these products into the marketplace and putting them into the environment for the benefit of agriculture. So the animal side isn't the elements that we represent.
Okay, donc...
Okay, so you're more focused on plants that have been genetically modified. Why is your organization is not wanting to have any labeling, and you're fighting tooth and nail against it? When I go to the grocery store and I want to buy any vegetable, I would like to know what I'm eating. I would like to make choices. So why is your organization fighting tooth and nail against labeling?
2 points on that. When it comes to mandatory labeling by the Government of Canada, that's focused on health and safety and nutrition. And we think that's paramount that the government continues to focus on those two elements, that if there's mandatory labeling, it's related to health and safety and nutrition. When products of biotechnology are approved, they've been deemed safe, both and equally nutritious, so they wouldn't hit either of those two check marks for mandatory labeling. The second point that I would put there for someone who's looking for choice in the marketplace, there are many brands who have chosen to take that on, whether it be the non-GMO project with 80,000 different products, the organic system, which is non-GMO. So for someone, and then there's free labels of non-GMO that others may use. If someone's looking for that option in the marketplace, the market has responded to provide them. But when it comes to government-mandated labeling, we feel strongly that the government needs to maintain that health and safety focus. Otherwise, it would confuse the public as to why a label is there. It would represent a health and safety risk that doesn't exist.
Écoutez.
Look, we're talking about confusion with the public. To my knowledge, there's only Canada and the United States that refuse the labeling to their populations. So Is there not some way at some point in time that we as Canadian citizens would be able to know what they're putting into their plates? In Europe, we can know that. There's only Canada and the U.S. Why are you saying that the government is worried about health? Well, exactly, that's right. I would like to focus on my health as well. I would like to know what I'm putting in my plate. And I'm an adult and I'm vaccinated.
And I think you can feel confident that the risk assessment process has ensured those products are safe before they enter the food system. When it comes to, you look at Europe and Canada, I think it's a good example there where the trust in our food system and the trust in biotechnology in Canada is much higher than it is in Europe, where they have taken a non-health and safety labeling approach. So that hasn't helped consumers there feel more comfortable. And if I can add one other piece, Health Canada did a great study in 2016 where they asked people, why did you want products labeled, general population? And the response was because we don't know what GMOs are. And the findings of Health Canada were that putting a label on the product wouldn't help you know what it is. It would only help you know where it is, and that what was needed was more proactive communication about what GMOs are, why they're safe, and why they're in the food supply.
Non, écoutez, je vous
I'm going to stop you on that. I don't agree at all with the fact that I have to trust with what it currently exists. And now I'm going to turn to Miss Karen. Fish DFO Canada published a scientific report in 2013 and salmon. So now I'm turning to genetically modified salmon. And in the report, from pages 16 to 18, they say that the danger for the wild Atlantic salmon are at a level of reasonable uncertainty. So, and the Atlantic Federation, Salmon Federation, testified before the Senate about their concerns. So we can see the industry doesn't want labeling, whether it's on vegetables. I'm sure it's the same thing for salmon. So what, in your opinion, are the potential dangers for human health and biodiversity if our legislation is not updated on genetically modified organisms?
Thank you for the question. I'll take the human health issue first. The concern here is that unintended consequences of gene editing and genetic engineering can result in the production of proteins that are allergens for some people. That's not to say that every GMO product has allergens in it, but that the potential is there. And that is why most people want labeling, because they fear that there may well be products in the genetically modified.
Thanks very much. Ms. Collins, you might want to, I don't know if you want to continue.
Yeah, I'd love to maybe just let Ms. Riston finish her sentence or finish the question.
That was the health side of things. From the point of view of the genetic issue that was raised, the problem is that these fish will compete. They're quite capable of interbreeding with wild Atlantic salmon. They are also capable of competing with them for food, and given that they're engineered to grow more rapidly than normal fish, one assumes they will be very hungry and taking up a great deal of the food supply. Those Atlantic salmon that we have left on the East Coast are in a perilous state and cannot withstand that kind of interference. The only answer to SEPA toxicity that was given in the risk assessment was containment. And that requires a company with a culture of safety that treats its biosecurity seriously. And we have grave concern that that is not Aqua Bounty.
So much. And just to follow up on that, we heard from a witness, and I come from a riding on the West Coast on Vancouver Island. We heard from witness in the previous panel who was representing the Stenenemo First Nation, so just a little bit north of where I am. And she expressed similar concerns that I've heard from First Nations leaders on the coast about both the danger to the food systems, but also to their culture, the importance of salmon to First Nations along the coast. And we've also heard from Indigenous folks who are concerned about the patenting of salmon DNA and what that means for their cultural rights. Can you speak at all to those issues?
I have heard witnesses speak very profoundly about those issues, and I think what struck me most was how aghast they were at the thought that a fish that has not only sustained them by way of providing food directly, but sustains their entire ecosystem, could possibly be now owned by a corporation somewhere. For millennia, they've counted on the salmon returning to create all of the foods and medicines that their culture is founded on. And now that is no longer public property. That was quite a surprise.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for all the work that your organization has been doing to protect wild salmon on the West Coast as well. Maybe just quickly to turn to Mr. Affleck, you had mentioned that you mainly focus on plant GMOs. When I was doing a bit of research, I noticed that GMO Answers, which is a website, is funded and kind of a website of CropLife International. They had a page on Aqua Bounty, kind of responses to some of the concerns. But the question of First Nations and Indigenous concerns wasn't mentioned there. I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all.
Fortunately, wouldn't be very familiar with that specific page. The GMO Answers, you're correct, is part of our global group's effort to kind of get more information about GMOs out there. And I think the GMO salmon became such a big question that they were trying to fill that gap. But I'm not familiar with the details of that piece, unfortunately.
Can you speak to the two amendments from the Senate that you said you do support?
Yes, I think so. The reduction in animal testing, I think, is one that's important. Our sector has come a long way and agrees with some of the statements that were made earlier by testimonies earlier in the week that there's computer models, there's complex extrapolations that can be done now that can fit that space, and our industry is ready to go there. And I think that SEPA can provide the space for the departments to figure out how quickly they can get to where the industry is trying to go to remove those requirements. And I think that's one general element of thinking of this as a legislative discussion, and at times I feel some of these amendments feel like regulation within legislation rather than enabling so that the departments can figure the regulation out.
And the other? You said there were two amendments, one went on Indigenous.
Oh, and the other was Indigenous engagement. So in that element, all the pieces of the preamble that were there and the importance of engagement of the Indigenous community, we have no objection to.
And I think the kind of engagement with First Nations and Indigenous communities is so critical, especially when it comes to Part 6, this section that treats animals as substances. So just back to Ms. Riston, can you speak to some of the kind of larger, I know Nature Canada is going to be submitting some amendments, but in the future we need to really overhaul this section. And so I'm curious if you can speak to a bit more about what the big picture changes that are needed.
Well, I think the Senate addressed a number of them. I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback here. The main...
If you could just raise the arm of your mic a bit more. Yeah, thank you.
The main concern that we had was, of course, the ability of citizens to participate in the process, to provide evidence, to review evidence, and to know how these living organisms are being assessed. And I think that the Senate amendments have gone a long way to addressing that. The demonstrable need for the living organism is the way that we would like to introduce the conversation about the ethical, the cultural, and social implications of genetically modifying animals where there are wild counterparts, and the danger exists that those wild counterparts could be damaged by the genetically modified organism.
Thank you very much.
We're now at the second round, and we'll have to limit it to 4 minutes each and 2 minutes each, respectively, so that we can end by 10:02. So, Mr. Deltel, you have the floor for 4 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, witnesses.
The Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association, Madame Coombs. Madame, I want to hear you about the impact that you see for your group about the watch list. Is that a big concern for you with the amendment that made by the...
I think as I mentioned...
Sorry?
Yeah. No, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
we can.
Yes, I think I had mentioned in my testimony that it's been somewhat misnamed, the watch list, because we currently have what I would consider to be a watch list, and that is the SNAC, the Significant New Activity List. And I think that that is what we're looking at, is what we would see is as the list of ingredients that have been put on a notice that they can only be used for certain uses. I think the challenge we have is that it's not necessarily named correctly. So the watch list isn't named correctly, nor is the SNAC. And so, and another challenge is, of course, is being able to try to find it on the website and understand it. So there's no context around what it is and what it means to Canadians. So definitely some areas of improvement there.
So you consider that the watch list as it is done right now is not available or not very efficient. Do you think if the government address it correctly with more clarity, do you think it will be more acceptable for you?
I think it's around the context so that it's meaningful to Canadians about what is a SNAC list and how it's being used by industry and by government, and then being able to find it more easily on the website. So I guess I think by calling it the watch list is problematic and the way it's currently framed. So I don't necessarily believe that we need to have it in the Act as it is written.
Thank you so much. We'll ask some question to Dr. Taylor. You're welcome to your House of Commons committee, Madam. Based on your experience, I think you will recognize that Bill S5, when it was tabled, well, by the way, 2 years ago, is not exactly the same now with so many amendments made by the senators. So I would like to hear you, what are your thoughts about this, the amendments, and is there some amendment that we should keep or some others that we should erase? What are your thoughts on that?
I think my colleague, Mr. Affleck, has already addressed the issues that we have concerns with and the amendments that we support, so I don't really have anything further to add to that.
Okay, so do the Senate amendment addressing Corp Life Canada's substantive advances with respect to pesticide and modern plant breeding and the plant science industry economic and environmental contribution, or do you think that they are redundant?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, okay. So do the Senate amendment addressing the Crop Life Canada's substantive advances with respect to pesticides and modern plant breeding and the plant science industry's economic and environmental contribution, or are they redundant?
Yeah, I think the Best Placed Act and Best Placed Minister manages these products very well through PMRA, CFIA, and Health Canada. So much of what was in that Senate amendment was redundant and would create confusion within the marketplace. And I think that science, risk, and predictable regulatory structures is what allows innovation to flourish, and I think we have that now.
Okay, so...
30 secondes.
30 secondes, okay. Not any time.
Apprécié. Ms. Thompson for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like, if I could, to begin with Ms. Combs. Would you be able to share your opinion on how strong protections for human and environmental health supports good business?
That's an interesting question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with respect to how my member companies operate, all of our ingredients are regulated under CEPA, so the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and then many of our products are regulated under the Food and Drugs Act, under the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act, as well as a Hazardous Product Act, and the Food and Drug Act. So we have we're highly regulated, but we are able to provide Canadians safe and beneficial products when used according to the label, and of course we're able to be competitive in this environment.
Thank you. And sort of coming off that, if you could discuss the risk of duplicating regulatory regimes for product labeling that already exists under Canada Consumer Protection Act if labeling measures were pursued by S5, and somewhat coming off your last statement.
Certainly. So thank you for that, Mr. Chair. So I think what we see right now in Canada is that we have a wide range of laws: CEPA, the Food and Drug Act, the Pest Control Products Act, the Hazardous Product Act, and the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act. They all have respective regulations that govern labeling in a very scientific way. And what they do is they provide and ensure that Canadians have the right information on the product to use the product properly, that they have first aid statements, and in most cases, disposal statements. So where you see this coming forward and complementing all of those other acts through SEPA is that S5 has added labeling to the preamble, as well as to Section 68 of the bill, and highlighting that, but really bringing to light what currently exists, which is Section 93 1Q, which allows the departments to create regulations through risk management processes. And we're seeing that manifest itself through, for example, through MECO, which is an ingredient used in paint that is actually has a statement on the products now that say use in a well-ventilated area. We're also seeing that there's been labeling statements provided for MDIs, which is an ingredient that's used in foam sprays. And through that, there's been additional labeling created to ensure that we have protective eyewear, so PPE. And I think that what we see in Canada is what we do really well is we assess the risk, and the products and uses are labeled accordingly. So it protects consumers and workers.
Thank you. And if I can get a quick question into Ms. Reston. I come from the east coast of Canada, and you reference Atlantic salmon. And certainly I'm, well aware that ocean health is often an early indicator of environmental health, and certainly we see that in Atlantic salmon, what has occurred to the stocks over the last number of years. You also referenced containment, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on how to create the balance between containment with GMO, but also understanding changes in sea levels, the environmental realities, and certainly what we've seen on the east coast of Canada recently, which was an extreme weather event with severity of a storm, but also in Newfoundland and Labrador, severity of sea surge. So how you're able to balance the reality of the environment with also the concept of containment with modified organisms.
10 seconds, please. I'm sorry that it's so short, but that's what the clock is telling me. You're on mute.
I doubt I can answer that question in 10 seconds, but the facility must be located so that there is no possibility of effluent from the facility entering public waters.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey, 2 minutes. Yes, thank you. Mr. Affleck, earlier I said that I'd lost confidence in certain regulators, and I'll give you 2 examples. In Quebec, there's an agronomist, Mr. Louis Robert, who spoke out against undue pressure from the pesticide industry and fertilizers on elected members and on officials of the Agriculture Ministry. Last September, a second example, it was discovered that a working document that was shared by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency was using documents created by representatives from the pesticide industry and the GMO industry. So the author was a person who works, an employee for CropLife Canada. So do you find that normal that private industries would put their financial interests above the health of the earth and humans?
Politely, I would challenge the assertion made there. Our industry is very committed to safety. Individual opinions on the happenings in individual provinces is their opinion, but the regulators in Quebec are independent regulators, as are the ones that regulate the nation. And I think we can trust in those institutions, and specifically on the document writing, CropLife Canada did not write any document for the Government of Canada. That was clarified by the Minister and the Department, and a large number of organizations had that document shared with them, and it was a technical error in which our name was recorded as the author, but we were not the originators, and we were being consulted on that with various other parties.
Do I have time for a second question? For a comment, rather. Well, I will just say that Ms. Karen explained to us what the cumulative effects are of everything that we can find in the oceans, but I think we won't have time for an answer. Well, that's a very big question. Yes, indeed. Ms. Collins for 2 minutes.
I'll just give Ms. Erston an opportunity. If you have more than 10 seconds on Ms. Thompson's question, I'd love to hear the answer.
Well, when we're looking at containment facilities, one of the most important things is how the effluent cleaning process is designed. And we have a terrific example of a good way to do that in the Kutera closed containment facility built by the Namgis First Nation on Vancouver Island. In that case, there is no possibility of any release to the wild because of the number of screenings that the effluent goes through, followed by settling in a pond, essentially a reverse well, so that before any liquid effluent ever reaches a natural water body, it has already been cleaned 3 different ways. The location of the facility. The location of the facility is also critically important, particularly as was observed in the context of rising sea levels and increasing storm surge. You need to be sure that that facility is going to be impervious to storm events that could damage it and cause an unscheduled release of the living organism.
Thanks so much. I know that earlier this year, I believe, or potentially late last year, Brazil documented the first case of a genetically engineered animal, a transgenic aquarium fish, as you mentioned, breeding in the wild. Can you talk about the kind of the real risk and the impact? What would happen if that were to happen with the Atlantic salmon that's now being consumed here in Canada, and or if this is expanded, and what the danger is to our dwindling Pacific wild salmon stocks?
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we'll go to Mr. McLean, see what his questions, if they relate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to ask Ms. Coombs a question here, because in your testimony you talked about repealing Section 67, which relies on the Minister of Industry to make sure that foreign imported goods meet Canadian standards, and you want that portion repealed. And can you tell us what backs up your recommendation there and what effect that would have?
Yes, thank you. So when I appeared before the Senate, I had confirmed to the senators that all the products, both domestically manufactured and imported, have to meet the requirements of SEPA, its various regulations. So the new substance notification, there's 3 sets of regulations for volatile organic compounds, and of course the various chemicals management plan risk management regulations. Those products, of course, all have to meet the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act and its regulations, the Pest Control Products Act, its regulations, the Food and Drug Act and its regulations, the Competition Bureau's guidelines, and then the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act. And I think that there wasn't kind of baseline of information provided during the development of that amendment. And so what we're seeing is that this particular requirement is going to be asking Industry Canada, which in our opinion does not have the scientific expertise, legislative tools, consumer products around post-market reporting and policies, et cetera, to address the intent of the amendment. And we think that if there are unsafe products, that we should have Environment Canada and Health Canada, who currently have very robust compliance programs, manage those. So we don't see the need to have Section 67 in this particular
Thank you.
Legislation.
Yeah, so you're saying that it is excessive. It's
covered.
It's already covered in other regulations. Yeah. So the industry minister
and by
doesn't.
Very robust. Yes.
Okay.
And
Thank
by a very robust compliance program. Yeah.
And I've heard a lot from both yourself and other witnesses here that if I can go through the different legislation we have here that needs to be covered by regulation: the Pest Control Act, the Hazardous Products Act, the Food and Drug Act, the Consumer Product Safety Act, the the Food Feeds Act, the Seeds Act. And I think there were a few other mentioned here. This is robust regulatory oversight. Let me ask Mr. Affleck here: is there some way of streamlining this so that we can have the same regulatory outcomes without the regulatory burden of you going through several channels on? And if so, what would you recommend streamlining in this bill so that you don't have another costly and burdensome regulatory requirement?
Yeah, I think going back to the originally tabled version of the bill was quite effective at strengthening SEPA, but appropriately, in such a way that it doesn't duplicate what's happening elsewhere. That's really what we want to avoid is duplication or confusion. And I think we just finished as a government a regulatory roadmap strategy through the Treasury Board Secretariat that was designed to detangle some of these, so to retangle would be dangerous. So I think that the idea is that when looking at any amendments to really analyze them and look for are they redundant to existing procedures. And when we look at plant-based biotechnology, we have a 30-year history of success in Canada and then again around the world on the benefits it can provide. So the robust regulatory program has been working quite well to date.
And let me just to kind of put a number on that. You talk about this regulatory burden obviously has a fiscal drag on your industry, on the whole country. Would you be able to put a pin in how much that would actually cost your industry and therefore Canadians?
A good example would be a conventionally bred wheat variety would cost roughly $1 million to bring to market in 7 to 10 years. To bring a genetically modified version of that to market costs $150 million and takes 16 to 19 years. So the regulatory burden is quite significant, and that doesn't mean there shouldn't be the appropriate level that's in a risk basis, which we have now, but continuing to move to streamline that is important. And I think the departments themselves and the appropriate acts are always working towards that streamlining, and we wouldn't want to undo
We'll go
that.
to Mr. Duguid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question would be to Ms. Taylor, Mr. Affleck. Your testimony on CBI, confidential business information, it sounded like you stressed the importance of public confidence. I heard you say those words. I may not have internalized everything you said, but would you have any specific suggestions for improving public confidence in CBI? Because based on the testimony we've heard, there do seem to be some questions in some segments of the Canadian public.
Yeah, I think the importance is finding the balance between transparency on CBI and inhibiting competition, because then trade secrets or information that's specific. So to get to that point, I think it's not about radical transparency of all the information being available. It's important that the government summarize that in a way that an average Canadian can understand what that information meant and how it played into the decision.
Is that the case now?
It is the case now.
So the system is perfect, doesn't need any changes. That's what we've heard from other folks from industry.
I would agree that it's quite functional. And if there's tweaks that are needed, it would be the departments themselves that are managing those files, I think, are well positioned to make those transparency changes as they see fit with their stakeholders.
Okay. Last question to Ms. Coombs. We heard from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, very detailed, very impressive brief that they've presented us. And they were the gentleman was contrasting the REACH and the CMP system that we use, the risk-based system. Ms. Coombs, you've been involved in this file for, I think, 25 years or so. So you've seen this evolution over time, and I think it was Mr. Castrelli argued for at least moving some elements of CEPA over to this hazard-based approach versus the risk-based approach. I wonder if you would reflect on that and offer some comment to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for the question. I think that what's really interesting is that this committee back in 1999 was the first to initiate the amendment that it was around the categorization and screening of the domestic substances list, which ultimately turned into the Chemicals Management Plan, which is a world-leading program. And I think, as I mentioned in my opening statement, Canadians should be very proud of that program. It is risk-based. It deals with environmental issues, and it deals with human health. And I think that we've set the bar really high, and I know other jurisdictions want to emulate that. And I think that we shouldn't be afraid to stand up and say that CMP is a world-leading program, and that our substances are assessed and our products are assessed appropriately.
So this committee, working together, collaboratively, produced the modern CEPA that we know today that we're trying to improve.
Very much so.
All right. I hope my colleagues heard me.
We'll end on that positive note. Thank you to our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to our witnesses, and thank you, members. Have a good evening. We'll see you on Friday for the minister's visit.
Bonsoir.